Welcome back, everyone. I hope the technical sessions were outstanding and everybody learned a whole lot about the science we're doing on Space Station. Now we're going to have our last panel of the day, the title of which is Catalyzing Economic Growth Through Public-Private Partnerships. Remember, questions need to be submitted through the app. We've fixed our technical difficulties and we're all ready to handle that this time. This should be a very dynamic panel based on standing back there when these guys were all getting mic'd up. I'm actually a little afraid because the amount of kibitzing they were doing. This could be a little hard to control. So we're going to turn that over to Miss Dr. Mary Lynn Dittmar to try and control these guys. Good luck, Mary Lynn. Mary Lynn is the president and CEO of the Coalition for Deep Space Exploration, which is an industry trade group of 70 companies focused on human exploration, space science, and commerce in space. She's a member of the User Advisory Group of the National Space Council. She's a member of the Space Studies Board of the National Academy. She's a member of the Commercial Space Transportation Advisory Committee for the FAA Office of Commercial Space. She's a member of some other things, and we don't actually think she sleeps, but whatever. About 100 years ago, she actually worked at Boeing and helped build the ISS and develop operations. She consults with NASA, with CASIS and National Lab, and with the nation on economic development of LEO for the last 20 years. And if you say commercialization of LEO in front of Mary Lynn, she really hates it, just FYI. Economic development of low Earth orbit, just saying.
So thanks for coming to the final panel of the day. Public-private partnerships have been in use in the United States almost since the beginning of the United States, in one way or another, and they've actually been in use around the world. So we think about them as something that's relatively new in the space world, but that's also not true. They were a key tool for NACA before NASA, and actually helped grow the whole aeronautics industry in the United States and aviation industry and the airlines. They've helped to drive industry forward, they've injected innovation, they've remade or opened markets, and they've driven down costs. But they're not a panacea. Their success depends on balancing government and industry roles, and balancing discretion and risk, and most of all, understanding how you are going to go about balancing discretion and risk. At the most fundamental level, one needs to have well-defined rules, procedures, and incentives to induce private actors to do something that's in the national interest, including the public good in space, because obviously they have a profit motive, which is, in my view, a good thing. That said, there are common issues that persist whenever public-private partnership is used in space or otherwise, including assignment of rights to real and intellectual property, the use of government loans and subsidies, and the use of public assets. This panel will focus on the role and importance of public-private partnerships as a transitional step to the growth and development of a sustainable economy of low Earth orbit and beyond. So joining me today is a very, very distinguished panel. The way that we're going to work this is that I'm going to just ask each one of these gentlemen to introduce themselves, just give a very short bio, and then speak for a few minutes about their experience with public-private partnership, with the development of commercial interests, with alignment of commercial interests and national interests, however it is that they want to talk about it. So it's a very diverse panel made up of people who have a broad range of experience. So here we go. Koichi?
Okay, Melanie, it's my honor to be here. Good afternoon. My name is Koichi Okada. I'm JAXA VP for Human Spaceflight Technology and Exploration. I'm also an astronaut. Actually, 10 years ago today, I came back to the Earth after spending on the station for 4.5 months on STS-127. My commander, Mark Polanski, somewhere here. And if you're here, thank you for taking me back home planet safely. My family appreciate it. So it's already 10 years. Last year marked the 20th anniversary of the space station assembly. Started. And this year marks the 10th anniversary of the Japanese Kibo module launch, and that was in 2009. And the year before, for the Japanese module Kibo launch, there are 3 shuttle launches required, and in 2008, the largest pressurized module, the Kibo module, was launched. And right after that, we have already started the commercial utilization of the Kibo module in a form, what we say, a fee-based utilization of the Kibo module. So we at JAXA are promoting with the commercialization of the small satellite deployment, and also the utilization of the exposed facility that is attached to next to the pressurized module. So those are the 2 areas that we have already transitioned to the commercialization. And our private company providers, Space BD and Mitsi, are already here. And we entered the stage of promoting private sector's participation, but still it's in just a small part of the LEO asset that we have. And we expect the larger areas of utilization that exist for the private partners' participation for more. And we are making, for example, some of the larger areas that I'm talking about is protein crystallization for the pharmaceutical drug design support. And JAXA is making every effort to achieve this meaningful, or I would say effective commercial results under contract, under a comprehensive contract with a venture company, Pepti Dream. So that but the company has a worldwide alliance, so they can be the pathway for the customers for the pharmaceutical drug design, utilizing the crystallization technique of the Kibo module. And we have been consistently talking with the private sectors for potential cooperation in various fields. And last year, JAXA released a request for information in 2018, asking for ideas from the private sectors for space business. And we have been already coordinating with possible collaboration companies such as application of astronaut training for education, and also creating a future space food business. I hope some of you like the Japanese food, but whenever we have this commercial crew vehicle going up to low Earth orbit, eventually, if Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos send passengers to the moon, like Maezawa-san of Japanese, and he already has bought some tickets with Mr. Musk, I think, going around the moon. So for those future tourists, I think creating this space food business should be very interesting. So these are already starting as part of this RFIs that we have conducted last year. And we have, through this RFIs last year, we identified the general demands for the exposed facility usage of the Kibo module. So we have selected provider last year, Space BD again, for the service as a service provider for the exposed facility. And I think it's very important for us to continue dialogue with those private sectors, and that will result in more specific needs and plans for the commercial use of the Kibo and ISS. As I said earlier, JAXA started the commercialization use of the Kibo module in the early stage of the Kibo 10 years ago, 11 years ago. And this was in order to examine the possibility of the commercial use of the Kibo module, although it was in a very small scale. And we believe that our efforts in promoting the commercialization of Kibo utilization is essential to encourage the private sector's participation. Although I would say at this time they may not directly help reduce the cost of the Kibo module, but that was a good start. That was the intention of us, because we have to expand it so that they can play a more significant role in the operation, and that will eventually lead us a reduction of the cost of the utilization and operation. So we expect the future LEO utilization is carried out with the cooperation among the governments, international governments, and private sectors. Those utilization will be conducted in this collaboration between the governments and private sector. However, the utilization services can be provided by private sectors, for example, like free flyers, or even a small capsule, a return capsule that can bring back the samples of protein crystallization back to the Earth. Those utilization service could be provided by private sectors, not by the government. So the public-private partnership seems to be a key in order for us to create more market and lead the LEO to a marketplace for the future. So the International Space Station is an essential asset for us to promote this trend of public-private partnership in order to create more market in LEO. And I will stop now, and then I'll get back for more examples of how we are conducting the approach for the commercialization of the Kibo.
Okay, thank you. Mike?
I have to speak after the astronaut. Bad seating choices. So I'm no astronaut, I'm a recovering attorney, I like to call myself, still the rehab. My name is Mike Gold. I'm Vice President for Civil Space for Maxar Technologies, and also chair the NASA Advisory Council's Regulatory and Policy Committee, and serve as chair of another FACA, the Commercial Space Transportation Advisory Committee. And let me say, wearing both my Federal Advisory Committee hats and my experience at Maxar, private-public partnerships are important. I would say that the countries that execute public-private partnerships well are going to be the economic, technological, and national security leaders of the future. We are in an era of great powers competition, and the field is shifting, where we're looking at not just an export-import bank, but direct subsidies. We're looking at aggressive export credit agencies, aggressive spending by federal governments to prop up and make their industries, whether it's space or otherwise, competitive. And public-private partnerships are the key to all of it. It's the key to the future. And NASA, as always with technology, but not just technology, but as you pointed out, with procurement methodologies, has led the way. That the initial OTA was the Space Act agreement. Because the bottom line was we didn't know what we were going to be dealing with in space. So you couldn't go with a traditional procurement practice. But I'd like to say that we still have a lot of room to grow. We need to do better with PPPs. We need to expand their utilization because frankly, we can no longer afford just to pay for the government goal. Now we're to the point where we not only need, with our taxpayer dollars, to achieve the government goal or objective, be it exploration or science, but to also inspire, infuse technology and capability into the private sector at the same time. Because if we don't do that, countries that are unable to execute those PPEs are going to lose the international competition. Let me say, wearing my NAC hat, that as we look at PPE implementation, as Koichi said, a great example of that is the International Space Station. This is our laboratory for experimentation and commercialization. And there, the NAC, which Jeffrey is a member of, we're concerned with intellectual property issues. Where's Cynthia? Look up Cynthia from So Even. Our friends over at the ISS National Lab have also been very concerned with this topic. That if you're going to have a public-private partnership, it's often not just what the government is going to do, but the entire regulatory regime needs to be able to accommodate those activities. So right now on the ISS, there's concerns that if you invest your money, you may not be able to get everything back out of it because the government might have margin rights or be able to get aspects of the IP. That needs to change. Export control, right? Our old favorite topic, that if we're going to commercialize on ISS or in low Earth orbit generally, those entities that do that, those private sector companies are going to need to enjoy the same exemptions, the same advantages that the ISS has. It only makes sense. And then putting on my Maxar hat, when we say public-private partnerships, that doesn't have to automatically mean Space Act agreements. So everyone drink your coffee, because this now is a discussion only an attorney could love, right? It doesn't have to mean just SAA, that you can execute public-private partnerships under a FAR-based contract. It doesn't have to be a Space Act agreement. And at Maxar, a great example of that is the power and propulsion element, which to me was the most commercial program that was done without having commercial in its name. And what you looked at there, because this was a little bit of a different public-private partnership, you want fixed price, you want to think about commercialization, and this is what's so wonderful with Artemis and what NASA is doing and Jim Bridenstine's leadership, that commercial is not an afterthought. It's in NASA's organic statute to fully commercialize space to the greatest extent possible. And so even with PPE, which is the cornerstone of Gateway, we're looking at what are the commercial activities that can be done? What are the ride shares you can do? What's the branding? What's the advertising? And we're looking at these things now instead of after it's implemented like we unfortunately had to do with the ISS. And another big aspect of that is the government needs to set the goal, set the objective, and let the private sector develop a solution. And that's what was done with PPE. Don't be prescriptive. Don't tell us every nut and bolt what color it has to be. Because if the government dictates that, you're going to get an exquisite system that is less relevant to the private sector, much more costly, and ironically enough, less safe, because you're not getting the commercial heritage that goes along with the system. You know, Maxar had a very affordable bid on the PPE, and people will come and ask me, well, how did you get there? I said, don't ask me, ask NASA, because they were the ones that enabled it by having a public-private partnership that, again, allowed us to develop a solution rather than have it be dictated by the agency. So we've got to get these right. We've got to do more. And both in my Maxar hat and as a NAC member, I'm very excited to see what the future has for PPs.
Okay, good afternoon. I'm Bob Richards. I'm Vice President of Strategy and Business Development for Northrop Grumman. And Northrop Grumman is very pleased to support this conference, and frankly, with my history, which goes back to launch vehicles and satellites, but more recently human spaceflight, and that's my current focus, is human spaceflight. Our Cygnus product line, which we consider a flagship product line supporting you all, is a big part of our contribution to the ISS community. And I call it a community because it's just really a wonderful, wonderful thing. I've never seen so many people that are so mission-oriented, whether it's sort of on the types of things that we do, maintaining supplies, critical supplies to the International Space Station, bringing scientific experiments up for operation, or the things we've been hearing about all through this conference, the very unique and game-changing experimentation that's happening on the space station right now. So it's an exciting time for our company. I'm in the innovation systems sector, and we handle all the human spaceflight and a lot of the commercial side of things. So starting with Cygnus, since I've got the floor in the audience here, I just want to kind of remind you of new elements of Cygnus, because it's an important product for us and we're always upgrading it. You know, the basics are mass and volume, and we're now routinely launching north of 3,500 kilograms every mission. And the volume is pretty unique. I know you all understand that the cargo and the experiments go up in different size bags, and we can handle the largest bags and the most numbers of bags compared to the other cargo options. We've increased the number of mid-deck lockers that we're taking up each time, and on the mission that's on the space station right now, we've got rodent capability. So rodent transportation capability for the first time. That's worked out completely perfectly with the 24-hour late load where the rodents are placed into the transportation area, and then up to space station for this critical experimentation. Other things that are coming up is the idea that we can plug into the station payload Ethernet and do experiments inside the Cygnus without actually bringing them into the station. That's been demonstrated with Tango Labs and some other experiments. And then we also have a lot of secondary missions on every flight, oftentimes CubeSat deployments and things like that. We can deploy CubeSats above the station for longer life, and we can do it for multiple areas. As far as public-private partnerships go, predecessor companies have done various ones, but I think for this audience, Cygnus itself is one of the better known of the public-private partnerships. And just as a bit of a recap, because it might be helpful in the overall discussion, there was two elements to the public-private partnership, sort of leveraging, Mike, some of the things you said as well. It doesn't just have to be a Space Act agreement. But we did start with a Space Act agreement. That was called COTS, and that was for the Cygnus development. But concurrently, there was CRS, which was a FAR-based system, FAR Part 12. It was fixed price. But it was done in parallel, and it was a critical part of the overall business case for then Orbital, now Northrop Grumman. And so under the FAR-based approach, we had a block buy of 6 missions, which formed the core nucleus, allowed us to pass on better prices to NASA because we were able to buy in at least slightly higher bulk than a single mission at a time type of thing. And the combination of the Space Act Agreement, which is very flexible, it's a good approach for government and industry to invest to a common goal, but has some deficiencies, like, for example, either party can walk away at any particular time. So if you're trying to build really a critical capability like PPE that the government definitely wants to get done, there's other approaches that maybe are better. So I'll kind of leave you with the thought, and we'll follow up in the question and answer period with different sort of pros and cons and stuff. But we definitely, as a company, consider the Cygnus use of a public-private partnership as being very advantageous to our company. We're very proud of that product, and with the nuances that we actually use multiple contract types and some other things, it was very successful for that particular application. Applying it to other things, everything is kind of a point design. There's pros and cons depending on what you're trying to do with the public-private partnership, and we'll probably discuss a little bit more of that later on.
Thank you.
Thanks, Marilyn. Vernon McDonald with KBR. I am Senior Vice President for Strategic Solutions. And KBR comes at the public-private partnership issue context from a slightly different approach. Just to give you a little history, KBR has really transformed over the last 3 or 4 years with some major acquisitions. And so what we brought together was a legacy of work in the space industry and a legacy of work in energy sector and also internationally. And as it turned out, that non-space part of KBR have exercised the public-private partnership quite extensively in the UK. And it's a particular form of public-private partnership called a private financed initiative. And essentially what the PFI allows you to do is take what would normally be a significant CapEx expenditure and amortize that across your OpEx budget. So take that and think about NASA's problems. NASA is confined to operate within a fairly limited budget. We heard from the administrator this morning that there are continual pressures to take from one portion of the budget to supplement another. And so, which of course is not acceptable. So how do you make that budget go further? And arguably, the utilization of the PFI approach, a version of public-private partnership, allows you to do just that. When you consider that NASA's ground infrastructure, if you've been to any NASA center, it's aging, it's out of date, it needs to be refreshed. We have a new mission in terms of returning to the moon. It requires new capabilities. That investment typically is a CapEx heavy investment. And the utilization of the PFI approach, public-private partnership, would enable NASA to refresh all of those facilities by utilizing external investment, going to the market essentially. And a company like KBR would be the broker between the government and the marketplace investors to enable that investment, allow for the facility refresh, amortize the costs across an OpEx type of relationship. And so I was really happy to hear Mike's comments that, the utilization of PPPs is really vital for economic, technological leadership. And I think there's a real opportunity for the utilization of PFIs in that context. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Jeff Manver, CEO of NanoRacks. When we began 10 years ago, we were the first company in the industry to own and market our own hardware on the space station. And in thinking about now what to focus on for the next couple of minutes, this is a tough act to follow. I think each of you has touched on a different aspect of the public-private partnerships. So I think I'll focus on 2 or 3. One is, when I look back on the growth of NanoRacks and the growth of the space station utilization community, what an extraordinary change in the relationship between NASA and the private sector. I can remember discussions 9, 10 years ago with people saying, why should you be able to take money? Why should you be able to have a profit? And this is where we always say, Mike, we're still waiting to make a profit. Okay. So, the very concept that NASA and the American government has evolved to an extent to allow the private sector to do what all of us are doing on station today is extraordinary, and it is testimonial to the men and women at NASA. And I really appreciate the growth curve that's taken place, and it's taken place on both parts. We've learned a lot about what we can do, what the limitations are. One of the things that strikes me in this conversation is that our focus, of course, is on NASA, but it takes a government. And it's Congress, for example, that funds NASA, Congress that funds cases. It's Congress that historically in our country has been there as much as any other, let's say, branch. Whether it was for the road, the highway system, or whether it was for postage stamps, airmail, Congress is there as well, and we can't forget that today. As well as I support completely this administration trying to advance the idea of government as whole, where the National Space Council makes decisions. And so part of the success of public-private partnership is to involve more than NASA, where we need NASA as the voice, the implementer, of course. The taxpayer has made the investment into the NASA, as you're saying, infrastructure, but we should remember that it always takes more than NASA to implement these programs. Another thing to just briefly touch on is capital. The private capital. And I can't tell you how important it is in the growing maturity of the public-private partnerships for the private capital, the investors, to see that the government is committed as well. The government is always challenging us, hey, do you have skin in the game? And that's correct. But the investor also wants to make sure that the government has skin in the game, and that the government is committed, and the government is in there with more than just a passing interest, and really sees this in their strategic development. And so it takes a large, it's an extremely challenging puzzle to figure out how you grow a market where none has previously existed. And the encouraging news is, space is not the first frontier, space is not the final frontier, space is our frontier for this time. And we can look back and see how we've done it in this country previously, and we can pave the way for, the next frontier, whatever that might be. But I am extremely encouraged by the maturing relationship at NanoRacks. We've gone through 3 or 4 different levels where we've put more and more investment. Now our biggest investment is the Bishop Airlock, and we're working with Boeing on that, and Thales Alenia, and it's large. It's a big investment for us, and something that just could not have been possible a few years ago. So it's encouraging. We need the public-private partnerships. I guess I'll end with one comment. I'm really tired. In Washington, people have said a lot to me, you're a hypocrite. You talk about commercial, but you're working with NASA. I get that, it's just, it's okay for aviation companies, for, United and Southwest to use airports that are built by the government, and everybody knows they're commercial, and it's okay for oil and gas to get, benefits. But somehow, in space, if you step up and say, I'm commercial, and you're working in a public-private partnership, somehow that still rubs people the wrong way. We can't do this alone. We need the public-private partnership, and it's growing remarkably strong.
Thank you, Jeff. So I want to thank everybody for their comments. I'm just going to start with a general question, and I'll throw it out there, and anybody that wants to pick it up can pick it up and run with it, and we'll see what happens. So we've heard some conversations here about what advantages there are to PPP, and in particular, the variety of different uses of PPP and applications of PPP. And and sort of characteristics of it. What do you think are the greatest cautions about it as we think about all this going forward? Not to be Debbie Downer, not at all, but just to sort of, if you're thinking about it going forward, what are the cautions you think we need to be aware of as we keep thinking about evolving this model, right?
So I think one of the foundational elements is that the interests of the two parties, the private and the public, need to be aligned. And if you have diverging interests, then it's not going to end well. And so, that requires a lot of open, transparent discussions between the two parties in order to get there. And so really, I think, trust needs to be there and alignment of interests.
And I think often we suffer from cost plus hangover, if I can call it that we're so used to doing things in that environment that even when we switch to a PPP and a fixed price concept, and not just the government, but commercial has trouble making that leap, where our requirements have to be set, they can't change from either side, there's not going to be more money, we have to recognize this is it. So I see the challenges often occur that we can use the PPP vehicle, but sometimes the culture and the mindset has not yet caught up to that actual framework. And then I think there's matters of transparency and the private sector putting that skin in the game. And just to go back to the situation with Cygnus, by the way, which I think is a great example, to me, potentially the greatest success of the CUTS program was not necessarily when anything flew, it's when Kistler was shut down. I had never before seen NASA actually cut an entity out of a program, and did so early enough that another entrant could come on board and actually succeed. Like that, I think, is PPP done the right way, and sometimes we can veer back into the old way of doing things and just keep everything alive forever.
Good thinking.
Yeah, that's good that you mentioned that on the COTS program, because everyone always thinks of the success of SpaceX and now Northrop Grumman being successful on that program, but there was a time where there was a dropout there. So probably to best understand how public-private partnerships can be implemented, lessons learned is really a good thing. The early days of the EELV program was an other transactional authority, and there was commercial market thoughts at that time that didn't come to fruition and caused a big restructuring within Lockheed and Boeing and the creation of the United Launch Alliance. So definitely you have to look at it point by point, and there are a few not successes, but it's good to also focus on the times when it is a success, and we certainly, again, consider Cygnus success. The government also put the skin in the game with the CRS minimum purchase of 6 right off the bat, and they carried that over into CRS 2 with that same minimum purchase. And you see Gateway Logistics at a draft RFP level having a minimum purchase as well. So I think that's good when the government puts it in black and white, and it makes the investors, to your point, Jeff, more comfortable when they see that skin in the game.
Okay. Jeff, do you have something? Okay. Koichi, I just wanted to follow up on something you'd said, which is that what is the most, I loved what you said, by the way, about this isn't necessarily dropping our costs yet. And it's important.
In the future, it should be changing, but
Understand.
It's a start. Right?
It's a start, right? So what do you think are the most successful cases of cooperation for Kurtz Kipo, if you had to pick, if you want to pick?
Yeah, so far, if you look at the perspective of the future markets, this small satellite deployment business that we selected 2 companies, Mitsui and Space BD, I would say this is probably at this time the most successful partnership with the private sectors. And then also now exposed facility usage, the external, because if you launch a satellite, the satellite system has to function perfect in order for a successful mission of the satellite. But if you want to develop certain things with the environment in space, we can utilize the space station asset to test the equipment. And if it doesn't work, then you can retrieve it and fix it, or you can return it to the ground and do analysis. So this kind of exposed facility usage is the second one. And we would like to expand that too for protein crystallization, selling that as a packaged utilization, doing this growth of the crystallization in orbit and return it on the SpaceX or Russian Soyuz spacecraft, and then doing the X-ray analysis. Doing this as an entire package and provide that capability of service to the users. This is another example of a successful commercial utilization, and we have not transitioned that to private sector's business yet, but hopefully it's going to happen.
Okay. Just still experimenting with it, learning about it, it sounds like.
Right.
So one of the things about the ISS that I think has been so wonderful is it has given us all the opportunity to learn. To sort of try out things, to try different business models, to explore a variety of different customers, to explore how you can develop technology and think about how you can commercialize. I do use the word, Mary Beth. Okay, how you can commercialize sort of that technology periodically. But Jeff, I was really taken about what you said about hearing, oh, well, if you do business with NASA, then you're not commercial. And yet you're maybe the strongest voice ever about the government as customer and how important that has been. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it seems to me there's two I always like to say, first off, we need the government as a customer. You can cut through, and I know now it's fashionable to say one of many. Okay, but that's a luxury. I'm not quite there yet. Okay, it's Sam. I'm sorry. Okay, it's next year, Sam. And so it's so important when we get approached. We're not big writers of policy studies or other things at NanoRacks, and people come to us and say, well, what reform do you need? What do you see? And all the time, the answer is very simple. Government as customer. Everything falls into place. If the government is truly no longer a competitor, they're a safety regulator, sometimes they're a landlord. In our case, they're a landlord, they're a safety regulator, they're less and less, they're a competitor, and they're a customer. And now, in that sense, it's even a public-private partnership, because a lot of times, if we don't produce, we don't get paid. And NASA is a kind customer, because they are also encouraging the development. But there are people who still say that if you work in this fashion, that is not commercial. And because, speaking of NanoRacks and speaking like the PPE and Cygnus and everything else, if it's you're developing the hardware and it's you and you have skin in the game, and at NanoRacks we fund the hardware, if we get a government to be a user of that hardware, that is a customer. And NASA has gotten far more sophisticated in the coming years, maybe in the last couple of years, which is in some cases unfortunate. But they're really making sure that the agreements are they're protecting their investment more and more, and so that is the solution. That we all know the problem. The solution is government as customer.
Thank you. Anybody else want to follow on that?
I'll add a second word to that, which is yes, absolutely. Government is customer and government is catalyst. So as we look at the power and propulsion...
Be careful you're not saying founding customer. If that's a fancy way to say.
Unlike you, Jeffrey, I am not going to offend Sam. Sam, we love everything you're doing. So I'm in proposal mode here. And again, honestly, the work that Sam, and I think I see Doug over there, it's easy for us to talk about this kind of thing. These are the people who are having to implement it. And as you can tell from this panel, it's not a bunch of shrinking violets. And I think it's been terrific, as you noted, Jeffrey, the progress that's been made in the relationship and the great job that's been done in terms of the ISS and LEO commercialization plan. But I also think catalyst is important here. And I think, again, this is this new era of taking a broader look at PPPs and what it means from a national basis. So for example, the government wants to develop better solar electric propulsion technology. We need that not just for NASA, but in the commercial sector and national security. Rather than simply make a straight-on investment in R&D, you can be a customer and use the power of the purse to purchase that system, which is a catalyst for developing that new technology. So not only does NASA, and I think the government as a whole, need to be the customer, but also the catalyst for key technologies that will drive this nation forward. Because I think if we don't look at it strategically like that, you know, both this nation and allied countries, et cetera, we'll be in a worse place relative to competition that is thinking at that level.
One thing I could add in this that could enhance this PPP's approach, what is called a Space Exploration Innovation Hub Center that we have. If you want to develop a certain, excuse me, new technology only for space application, and there's a huge, industry that could contribute to the space development. But if the application, the end user is only space, then it may not be as lucrative as they can be applied to other fields. So in this Space Exploration Innovation Hub Center, what we are doing is to work with the industry partners. But the outcome is not only for space, but also terrestrial application, like a remote control of the construction equipment that we could use for building the base on the moon. But at the same time, you can do the same thing. From one controller, you can control multiple construction equipment all over the world, for example. So by having those, I would say, dual use, dual application, it will entice more industry, conventionally non-space industry, to participate in this development. And that could eventually, enhance this PPE, collaboration between the government and the industry. So that is something. And also, we are also doing a partnership program with the industry. Japanese space agencies have technical expertise, but the many non-industry companies do not have the know-how how to, launch, how to develop a certain space qualified equipment. By having our expertise working with the newcomers, we create the new business. So this kind of approach is what we have been doing at JAXA in order to double this market, not only for the LEO, but the space application in general.
Well, that idea, right, to get into that virtual cycle where you have the innovation and then you have the multiple potential customers, and then that drives more technology development and gives you broader opportunity to align, private interests and public interest. And so it's wonderful, when you can really get that going. So Vernon, I wanted to follow up a little bit because you'd started out by saying that KBR's approach to this was a little bit different, experience was a little bit different. Can you give us any more examples of PPP that's been filtered through KBR or the other way around?
Absolutely, yeah. So it's pretty interesting. So in the UK, their infrastructure for housing their soldiers was literally falling apart. From a safety point of view, health point of view, morale point of view, there were big problems. We established a public-private partnership with the UK MOD to completely refurbish the barracks and operate them over a long term. What it's done, obviously, is give the UK government a completely new facility. But because it's a long-term arrangement, contract, there are, call them service level agreements in there, so that in year 19 and year 20, the facilities are as good as they were in year 1 and year 2. And so there's a lot of upside for the government, not just on the financial, no big capital investment, it's coming from the market, but guaranteed kind of quality over the long term. That's one example of I think that lends itself to the infrastructure challenges that I referred to with NASA. And then another one is that we actually own a fleet of aircraft that are used for training of RAF pilots. So they're non-standard types of aircraft. Again, we own them, and through a public-private partnership, we keep them maintained, available, we house them, we basically supply the Royal Air Force with access to these aircraft. And so, from a cost, availability, kind of expertise point of view, the RAF is getting a pretty good deal. So these are, the creative ways, I would say, of utilizing partnerships to solve problems that I see many times over in the US as well. And so that's the impetus to introduce the kind of PFI approach that I referred to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this goes to the point that they are used worldwide, right? I mean, we have examples here, and they can be very, very useful. Well, I want to, this is a great conversation, and I sort of hate to interrupt it, but I do want to give opportunity to people on the floor. So y'all know you have to submit your questions via the app, which I don't have up here. And I think there's people in the back who are supposed to shout questions at me. Is that how this works?
So much for the app.
Yes. The first question we have is, which partnership contract type has delivered the best results for the taxpayer? Firm fixed price, IDIQ, or Space Act agreements?
So, okay, I'll go back to something I said earlier. It's about aligning needs and objectives. I couldn't rank order those contract types. Each has its place for a particular type of outcome, I would say.
And I'd also point out, we have to be careful of apples and oranges here. You could have a Space Act agreement that isn't firm fixed price.
Yeah.
Right.
So you're looking at different vehicles, and it's really what you're trying to accomplish. And again, there is a time and place for cost plus when you've got a situation that is unknown, and you need to deal with it. What I would say is what I've seen in my career be most successful, that when you've got a mature capability, is a firm fixed price, and then whether it's a Space Act agreement or a broad agency announcement. I think that we focused a lot on Space Act agreements, but to the detriment of BAAs. That has been extremely effective in terms of getting different ideas in, rather than have the government dictate the concept, and then make a selection, and then tailoring the FAR to match up to it. So I think that any of those vehicles can be successful if they're done well in terms of actually sticking to the firm fixed price and not dictating solutions and letting the private sector make those decisions.
Yeah, the open BAA has been extremely helpful in that, it allows you to submit ideas to the government, to the agency, as it makes sense for your company to do it, rather than having to match, to get the proposal writing team going on a certain date. And so I would add the open BAA is a very powerful and comfortable mechanism.
Okay.
Excuse me, what comes to my mind on that particular question is, as far as providing the maximum value and saving money to the government, I wouldn't underestimate the use of commercial development standards. That's really a sort of non-contractual thing. It wasn't in the question, but it's very well known that private industry over time has developed their own set of standards for doing things like commercial geostationary satellites and other products like that. And those standards have been proven to create products which are very reliable and have essentially the same flight reliability as when you get the sort of full government flow down of requirements. And so I would say the tailoring of requirements is oftentimes the best way to save money in a development, and that's where experience counts. It can be overdone, it can be underdone, but it's something that's definitely shown study after study to save significant costs when developing a new product.
I would just add that my own experience, and I testified to the National Space Council about this last year, it's not that this contractual mechanism is better than that contractual mechanism. It's what are the particular needs that you're trying to address? What are the goals? How are you going to balance risk? What's the engagement that you want from the private sector, from the public sector? And all of those things have to be worked through. And it does take some real expertise in thinking about procurement and acquisition and goal setting and managing risk And that's actually, my 2 cents, that's actually one of our greatest challenges, is creating within the government this core of people who have the capability to be able to understand those things and judiciously bring to bear what seems to be a better approach given a particular case. That's a challenge we're facing actually as a nation right now. So, my 2 cents. Next question.
Okay, the next question is, how do we foster economic participation in LEO for emerging space nations that don't have access to an ISS partner agency to provide government support or partnerships?
It's already happening through the non-partnership participation. And NanoRax has been flying other countries, and so is Japan. And so through different channels of commercialization, also through the joint program with the United Nations Office of Outer Space Affairs. Yeah, we have deployed the first satellites from Kenya, for example. They don't have direct access to space, but through this commercial collaboration, as also international collaboration, government to government, or intergovernmental organizations like United Nations, we have been supporting this capacity building of these many nations. That's one of the many fantastic outcome of the International Space
Yeah, and
Station.
I'll jump on your use of the word fantastic. It was almost unexpected.
Yeah.
I mean, the first non-ISS partner customer we had was the University of Hanoi. And I don't want to tell you what it was like telling Mike Reed I wanted to fly to Vietnam and marry Beth. I won't go into that. But we've flown the first satellites of Peru, folks in Peru, folks in Lithuania. And so by all means, whoever asked the question, you can be assured that there's multiple pathways. At NanoRax, we stay in close communication with NASA on every step we take. Right now, we just flew the research side of the Emirates program, flying a astronaut from the UAE, and NanoRax is flying the research side of that. So the pathway, as Wakata-san is saying, the pathway is there, and it's one of the fantastic parts of the ISS.
Yeah, it was mentioned this morning there are 103 countries that have participated in some way on board the ISS, which is just, go back to that discussion about the Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah, and I think the pathway is there for the small unmanned experiments, but I compliment NASA on what they did just recently with enabling commercial crew to take sovereign astronauts to the space station. It hasn't happened yet, but that's really in line. That's going to be the next step from taking a small scientific experiment up there to actually taking people with it to run the experiment from some of these nations that typically aren't considered spacefaring nations.
Other question?
What can we learn from past failures of public-private partnerships?
Can I say, Steph, for JAXA kindly invited me to a workshop in Tokyo, and I did a little studying. And I was struck by, first off, there was a Mr. Boeing, there was a Mr. Northrop, there was all men, but it struck me that there were entrepreneurs at that time. And one of the things that struck me with the airmail, and I had to explain to younger people in my office what airmail is. Okay, that's lovely. But Congress did not get it right the first time. They competed. There were 10 airline companies competing, guys with airplanes, including Mr. Boeing, and they weren't making money. So Congress went back and said, okay, we'll give you 10-year contracts and exclusives for each route. So in general, I see we don't have a lot of time left. What I would say, what I learned in looking back on history and also in my career is failure is okay as long as it's done safe in our business. And you just keep trying. There is no magic solution. So you just keep trying until you figure it out.
And let me just add to that NASA needs to be a customer. As we talk about COTS, there had to be CRS. Without CRS, COTS would not have succeeded. And sometimes I worry that there can be too great an expectation in terms of where the private sector is in a particular industry. And then if the government doesn't come in as at least a customer, if not an anchor tenant, that what could be a promising industry would then fail. I mean, Elon Musk has been very public about, if not for that COTS contract and CRS behind it, there wouldn't be a SpaceX. This would be a very different world. So the failures that I've seen is when we've become a little bit too much on the private side of the public-private partnership, a little too optimistic, and then when the government end hasn't been there, it hasn't gone as well as we would like.
Yeah, I might add just one other comment, and it goes to what you were saying earlier, Marilyn, about the national challenge right now around procurement. You know, these partnerships are not a panacea. They require hard work. They require very specific expertise on both sides of the table to make it work. I think, to your point, the country needs to think about that and making sure the government is a smart buyer at the end of the day. That's a really key issue.
And I just wanted to add to what Mike said, that it's important to be conservative on the expectations of investment. You know, the Kistler failure on COTS was really inability to raise money. And even in bigger companies like Northrop Grumman, there's lots of pulls for investment to do different things. And as exciting as this industry is to all of us, we're complete cheerleaders for the mission, but that doesn't really always extend to people who are either loaning money to small companies or making investment decisions in big companies between a wide range of potential options. So public-private partnerships, the government is protected because oftentimes these milestones are pay for accomplishment. So don't overdo it on investment requirements, cash requirements, and also just it's a perfect example of go slow will reach a positive outcome. Go too fast and you potentially can have problems.
Well, I want to wrap this up. Thank you to the audience for your questions, very thoughtful questions, and thank you so much to this panel for great discussion and really rich discussion, I think, of public-private partnerships. So thank you so much.
Thank you.